Welcome to History Comes Alive, the podcast that takes you on a deep dive into a new historical topic every episode. Join us as we explore the nuances of historical events you probably didn't learn about in school. Here's your host, Jeff Nichols.
Welcome back. We've been very busy exploring the life and times of John Underhill the last several weeks. Today marks the fifth and final episode looking specifically at his life. It certainly was accomplished. I hope you've enjoyed the time that we've spent. I really think mini biographies mixed into the larger storyline help to draw out the history, and it creates a better understanding of things that we can kind of take with us. Now, that said, we're looking at John Underhill because when we get to the Pequot War, which I promise is coming, he will get a few lines, a few mentions here and there, but nothing that would indicate to the casual reader or history observer the depth of his activities and contributions during these opening decades of the English and Dutch colonial experience in this region of what would become the northeastern United States. It's not always a pretty picture, but without the John Underhills of the darker corners of history, most organized societies would never have organized. We take it for granted, and we shouldn't. So the bulk of his killing days were behind him, and John Underhill moved to New Netherland. And just like the English communities, he was quickly plugged into various positions of leadership. You recall William Kieft was soon to be dismissed, and his replacement would be the very able, if not slightly difficult, Peter Stuyvesant, a veteran of the wars with Spain, where he had lost his right leg just a few years before. And Stuyvesant was a devout Calvinist and a strong nationalist. He was a capable leader, but also contentious. Now, our goal is to develop the necessary situations that involved John Underhill. So we may leave a lot for another time or your own reading pleasure. We may go through this in layers and not necessarily chronologically. We'll see how this goes. So upon arriving in New Netherland, John Underhill was elected a selectman to the Council of New Amsterdam. He was one of the 8 men that was to adopt policies towards the natives. He seems like an apt guy to put in charge of that. Then Peter Stuyvesant assigned him to Flushing, and in 1648 he was sheriff. From 1651 to 1653, he was a magistrate. So regardless of his brutality against his enemies, he must have had a charisma and an administrative ability that was obvious. He just keeps landing these important leadership positions. I will say this first few generations of colonials was full of capable men. Some of the future problems that we'll see in the decades to come would arise and escalate as a direct result of poorer leadership. So things were going pretty well for John Underhill. Things were going pretty well in New Netherland as well. It was a real melting pot. Now, this melting pot was fashioned after the tolerance model of the motherland, but also fashioned after the drive to make money. The melting pot of tolerance was a draw for skilled labor. Now, don't misunderstand. The colonizers of New Netherland were often devout religionists. The Dutch Reformed Church remained supreme, but there were allowances. And there was a kind of societal competition among the Dutch and the English, as well as a growing commercial competition that one day, about a decade later, would provoke the English to pass the Navigation Acts as a way to suppress Dutch expansion and commerce, and it also helped to usher in the First Anglo-Dutch War. The Dutch placed a heavy emphasis on setting up Christian communities. The English were pouring in. David de Vries, remember the man who exposed Governor Kieft's folly, is said to have commented once to said Governor Kieft, quote, "It was a shame that the English, when they visited Manhattan, saw only a mean barn in which we worshipped. The first they built in New England after their dwelling houses was a fine church. We should do the same." And with that, they did. The English arrived with such numbers that whole towns appeared requiring bilingual ministers. They were arriving in huge numbers throughout the English colonies. And some were coming through the spreading out, some for opportunity, and some because the Puritans, frankly, were hard to live under. These folks came with the promise of, quote, liberty of conscience according to the custom and manner of Holland, end quote. And Holland had been a very accommodating place for Englishmen. They were not the only arrivals. Along with Muslims and Jews, there were many varieties of Christian. Whole neighborhoods sprang up, like transplanted communities of closely knit and aligned groups. New Amsterdam was a place of commerce: Dutch, English, German, French, Scandinavian. Bergen and Rockland were Flemish. New Paltz was Walloon, especially after the revocation of the Treaty of Nantes. New Rochelle had the Huguenots. And I want to quote Benjamin F. Morris on this particular group of folks that settled in New Rochelle. Of these people, he says this: "The character of the first Huguenot settlers," says Dr. DeWitt, "was eminently worthy, both here and in other parts of the state and the United States. An interesting fact is related concerning the first settlers of New Rochelle in Westchester County. When they entered the forests and with toilful labor engaged in clearing and cultivating the fields, they resolved, in the spirit of deep piety which they brought with them, to unite with their brethren in New York in the public worship of the Sabbath, though at a distance of 20 miles. Such was their reverence for the sanctification of the Sabbath, that they would take up their march on foot in the afternoon of Saturday and reach New York by midnight, singing the hymns of the Clement Merit by the way. Engaging in the worship of the Sabbath, they remained till after midnight, and then took their march and returned to New Rochelle, relieving the toil of the way by singing Merit's hymns. Quote, happy and proud," end quote, says Bancroft. Quote, "in the religious liberty they enjoyed, they ceased not to write to their brethren in France of the grace which God has shown to them," end quote. And Long Island and Westchester and Dutchess welcomed the English. The Lutherans were numerous as well. They had worshipped with the Dutch Calvinists until their numbers grew to an extent that they requested their own church. And it was into this mixed population that Peter Stuyvesant arrived. He was not quite as welcoming and tolerant as one could have hoped. To the Lutherans, the response was to pass laws forbidding the preaching of unqualified people, or even the holding of unauthorized religious meetings. Furthermore, the town representatives were to be members of the Dutch Reformed Church. Now, back in the Netherlands, the policy was one of agreement and sentiment with Stuyvesant. But also there was a commercial aspect to their approach. I mean, basically, I'm not quoting anybody, I'm kind of paraphrasing the attitude, but it was kind of like this. I mean, Peter, just let them alone. Let them worship as they choose in private. Don't look too hard. I mean, there's money to be made, and the English are filling up their colonies quite nicely. So all the groups kept coming except Catholics. I mean, they were banned outright. They were seen by the Protestant Dutch as the same as the hated Spanish. And then there was the Quakers. Now, the Quakers have a reputation for peacefulness and piety, quietness, reflectiveness. Not so back in the day. The Quakers of these early colonial days were known as a riotous bunch, obnoxious. They were pacifists, but zealous pacifists. They refused to swear oaths and supported equality for women. I mean, very unpopular ideas for the time. They had been persecuted in England, and so many of them, like the Pilgrims and the Underhills and political dissidents, had ended up in the Netherlands. They were not very popular there either, but they were accepted more readily than in their homeland. So, like the Puritans and the French Walloons, New Netherland must have looked pretty good to the Quakers. They'd been banned in every English colony except Rhode Island. And even there, the ever-tolerant Roger Williams had more and more debates with the Quakers. He said that they, quote, refused to recognize sober rules of civility and humanity, end quote. Did you catch that? Roger Williams, the ever-tolerant Puritan minister, and speaking of the Quakers, said that they, quote, refused to recognize sober rules of civility and humanity, end quote. They must have been obnoxious. So much for the quiet, peace-loving folks of our pipe dreams. They arrived in New Netherland in 1657 and quickly appeared to be a challenge to the Dutch Reformed Church. Stuyvesant hated them. And that's where the trouble started, and our story really begins today. And it gets sticky. And John Underhill's hands, and those people around him, will be some of the stickiest hands in all of New Netherland. In response to the increasing threat of the Quakers, whom Stuyvesant believed to be an abominable heresy, with the desire to seduce many, if possible, even the elect, laws were passed and men and women were made examples of. Now, to get an idea as a reminder, we already went through this when we were talking about Massachusetts Bay, but to get an idea and to draw attention to and to remind ourselves of exactly what the temperature was in society at this time towards a lot of these groups, but especially the Quakers, I want to quote Thomas Jefferson Wharton Baker. Now, this is kind of an extended quote, but I think it really opens this up for us to understand as we work through the rest of this episode exactly what was going on and what the atmosphere was, who the players were and who they were representing. So Wharton Baker said this, quote, "The enforcement was rigid. When William Brend, after 117 blows on his bare back with a tarred rope, lay dying, Reverend John Norton remarked to the pitying bystanders, he endeavored to beat the gospel ordinances black and blue, and it was but just to beat him black and blue. At Dover, 3 Quaker women, Ann Coleman, Mary Tompkins, and Alice Ambrose, were made fast to a cart's tail, stripped to the waist despite the bitter northern winter, made to drudge half-leg deep through the snow, and at each of several towns whipped in their bare backs. In 1659, Mary Dyer, William Robinson, and Marmaduke Stevenson, who had come to Boston courting martyrdom, were sentenced to be hanged. They were conducted to the gallows, and the 2 men executed. Mrs. Dyer, after her hands and legs had been bound, her face covered, and the rope adjusted around her neck, was informed that she had been reprieved. She was taken to Rhode Island by her family, but in the following spring, having appeared once more at Boston, was executed. The hanging of William Ledra in November of 1660 concluded the executions of Quakers in New England, for Charles II gave orders that the vein of innocent blood opened in his dominions should be closed. The Baptists, too, were subjected to severe persecution. John Clark, Obadiah Holmes, John Grandel of Newport, upon going to Lynn to visit an aged member of their church, were fined an aggregate of 60 pounds. When Holmes was receiving sentence, he remarked that he blessed God that he was counted worthy to suffer for the name of Jesus. Whereupon Reverend John Wilson struck him, saying, "The curse of God or Jesus go with you." For refusing to pay his fine, 30 strokes were laid upon his bare back with a 3-corded whip. As he left the stake streaming with blood, 2 compassionate bystanders took him by the hand, but were themselves arrested, fined, admonished, and threatened with whipping. Many Massachusetts Baptists and Quakers found refuge in Rhode Island, where the advanced views of Roger Williams protected them from persecution. But the Quakers even here found themselves in opposition to the law requiring them to bear arms and drill on training days. So fled to Gravesend and elsewhere in the western end of Long Island, expecting there the liberal treatment usually accorded by the Dutch to all religious faiths. But they had not counted on the stubborn intolerance of Peter Stuyvesant. The governor had William Reap, a Rhode Island Quaker, arrested and imprisoned. John Tilton of Gravesend fined and banished for entertaining Quakers, and others treated with equal severity. Robert Hodgson was arrested at Hempstead, and refusing either to pay a fine of 100 guilders or, quote, to work at the wheelbarrow 2 years with the Negroes, end quote, was whipped on his bare back with a thick pitched rope until he fell to the ground, where he was left until nightfall with the sun beating down on his bruised, swollen body, end quote. Good times, huh? So you can kind of see where this is going. You can kind of feel the tension building as the Quakers begin to arrive. And most of those Quakers ended up in Flushing and Long Island. But before we finish this part of the narrative, there was an interruption in the societal development that they had to work through. And so we will too. Don't worry, John Underhill will play a major role in 3 more key developments. The Quakers will be our number 2. But for now, the situation between the Dutch and the English, 2 strong allies who had needed each other for decades, had deteriorated. The rush for colonies and money was too much for these 2 aggressive, entrepreneurial nations to overcome. The English passed the Navigation Acts to stifle the Dutch commerce in 1650, and the Dutch saw right through it. They went to war. And in 1653, John Underhill turned on Peter Stuyvesant. It was April when he learned that Peter Stuyvesant was planning to attack the English with the help of natives. Underhill's reaction was to hang parliamentary colors. That probably went over like a ton of bricks in a time of war. He spoke out against Stuyvesant publicly. He accused Stuyvesant of running an abusive government, according to his own will and not that of the people. John Underhill was imprisoned for a short time, and upon his release, he went to Rhode Island. Now, remember, he was not very welcome in Massachusetts Bay. It's kind of an odd cauldron here that was brewing. From Rhode Island, Underhill joined the United Colonies. Remember, these were the Puritan colonies that had band together for mutual protection a decade earlier. The funny thing is that the Rhode Island and New Hampshire colonies were not invited. Yet here it is, John Underhill, an unwelcome man in Massachusetts Bay, the leader of the United Colonies, joined them from an uninvited colony. I mean, go figure how this all works out. Rhode Island also commissioned him. He was commander-in-chief on land. And it was during this time of service, once again for the English, that John Underhill took the Dutch post of the House of Hope in Connecticut. It was located between Saybrook and Hartford and had been a genuine obstacle for the growing English commercial enterprise. John Underhill inspired real fear in his adversaries. Peter Stuyvesant believed he might attack New Amsterdam, so he built a 2,300-foot wall around the Dutch town for security. It was between 9 and 12 foot high. Its legacy is still with us today. Only its claim to fame is not physical security, but financial. This is Wall Street. What would have happened had John Underhill sided with the Dutch at this point? I mean, that could have happened. He was comfortable among the Dutch. He had lived among them most of his life. He was married to a Dutch woman. He had a Dutch daughter. I mean, how did he figure his loyalties? Personal opportunity, First Nation status to England for being the nation of his birth? I mean, we'll never know because it didn't happen. He sided with the English in both word and deed. John Underhill's defiance may have started a trend. It certainly seems to have emboldened the English population. In 1654, the war ended, and John Underhill moved to Long Island, and the issues with the Quakers can be picked back up at this time. So the big migration again occurred in 1657. Peter Stuyvesant made every effort to squash the community before it got a foothold. I mean, as we read, men like Robert Hodgson were prosecuted before there was a law in place. He inspired it. When it comes to the state, oftentimes it's kind of a where there's a will, there's a way kind of attitude. I think we're all aware of that. John Tilton and John, or Henry, Townsend, were victims of it as well. The state's will, Peter Stuyvesant's will. The law passed was tricky. It penalized anyone who housed a Quaker. When you think about it, that's kind of cutting him off at the knees. The general public was also encouraged to keep an eye on the Quaker activities. Well, actually, they were encouraged to report Quaker activity. The Dutch Reformed Church enjoyed a privileged status. All others were to remain quiet. The Quakers just couldn't do it. I mean, frankly, they were kind of the middle ground because, again, Catholics were banned altogether. What happened next has been referred to as a precursor, or one of them, to the freedom of religion enshrined in the founding documents of the current constitutional republic under which all Americans live. Some have called the English population's response to Peter Stuyvesant, quote, the religious Magna Carta of the New World, end quote. It's a document remembered as the Flushing Remonstrance. Now, the Flushing Remonstrance was a petition delivered to Director Governor Peter Stuyvesant concerning the law against harboring a Quaker. And it was drafted by Flushing Town Clerk Edward Hart, and it was signed by 30 people. This was a monumental statement. It was the most liberal document of its time. Remember, let's think about this from the vantage point of their world, not ours. Theirs was a world where state religions were the norm. Religious restrictions on some and preferential treatment toward others was the norm, often with violent consequences for the minority or the weak. Think about this situation. Many of the English had settled via New England. They had originally come from England in the name of religious freedom. Then, when they got here, they realized that some of their fellow dissenters were as hostile to real freedom as those that they had left behind. Actually, they were worse. They tried to escape the persecution and restrictions of their previously held views. And now, here they are again. I think they'd simply had enough. I mean, the end of their proverbial rope occurred on Stuyvesant's watch. Lucky him. The point is, Peter Stuyvesant comes off as the bad guy. But the reality is that in this time, he represented the prevailing view almost everywhere. The remonstrance was pretty bold. This was a dangerous move. I mean, here's what, in part, it said, quote, "We cannot in conscience lay violent hands upon them, but give them free egress and regress unto our town and houses, as God shall persuade our consciences. For we are bound by the law of God and man to do good unto all men and evil to none." To me, frankly, that sounds like an Anabaptist confessional. Anyways, it continues. It declared that, quote, "the law of love, peace, and liberty," end quote, "to Jews and Muslims." I mean, imagine the governor as he read this. Did he throw something across the room? Did he scream? I wonder, did he crumple the parchment? But it went farther. Within the Protestant churches, it stated that Presbyterians, Independents, Baptists, and Quakers could all contain valid truths of God. They believed that persecution itself could actually anger God. That's very out of step with virtually every power base of the day, which believed and put into practice that heretical worship brought wrath. That was Stuyvesant's position. If you're a heretic, you're encouraging the wrath of God. I mean, think about it. If you really believe that heretics bring about the wrath of God, your only course of action would be persecution to both protect the innocent and correct the wayward. I mean, it sounds like the Inquisition, doesn't it? Or the concept of capital punishment as they understood it. What we see as heinous, they saw as necessary for the souls of men. You see the depth of the divide here, right? I mean, this was dangerous. Here we see the idea of Dutch tolerance, basically keep your mouth shut in public, being interpreted by the English guests. You see that, don't you? The immigrants were challenging the hosts. They were there because the host allowed them to be there, because where they came from was worse than where they were. Everybody alive today has benefited from this struggle. Whether you practice religion or not, this is one of those watershed moments from the post-Reformation age that delivered for us all the idea of freedom of conscience, built into the fabric of civil servitude. And just like in their day, many today would deny that very concept to all who disagree with them. I'm not afraid of ideas. I'm afraid of a lack of integrity and a level of hypocrisy that dismisses intolerance in one instance and encourages it in another. So theirs was a very brave action. Brave and not without consequence. All the signers of the remonstrance were thrown in prison. This was a strong statement. There were many in these days, but one thing that stands out is the inclusion of non-Christian groups like the Jews and Muslims. Usually, these statements of faith or statements of tolerance revolved around the Christian community. And yes, there were Muslims in New Netherland. And yes, anti-Semitism was real across Europe. Strong statement. I think it's hard for any of us in this generation to really understand what was going on. Those born and bred here in the U.S., I'm speaking to you from America, just have not experienced this kind of environment as the norm in our lives. Think of it this way. How far out on a limb are you willing to go for people that you don't agree with? These folks did not have a lot of appreciation for the Quakers. They were loud and disruptive. They had a very different doctrinal structure. They were very zealous. So, again, breaking this down, a bunch of people stuck up for a bunch of other people that they did not agree with. They stuck up for them against a powerful zealot in his own right. They defended the defenseless against the power broker. Do you have the courage to do that? Do you have the conviction to do that? Is there anything you actually would stand for that would put you on the front lines in that way? These folks went to jail. Then they backed down and paid a fine. But that should not diminish what they did. Not in this instance, because there's more here. Change was coming. Peter Stuyvesant was not done yet, though. He was not happy with his quote-unquote victory. I mean, he'd broken the people. He blamed the Quakers. From this experience, it became necessary for all ministers to know Dutch, pretty much locking all the foreigners out, right? The general population was taxed to pay for a reformed minister. How would you like that? Even the magistrates in the Netherlands got involved. In 1662 and 1663, there's the John Brown incident, or controversy. And yes, it revolved around a man named John Brown, who had been converted to Quakerism and came to New Netherland from Massachusetts Bay. He'd been arrested for preaching Quakerism in his house. Now remember John Brown's name, John Brown, because we're going to come back to it. He was not just arrested, he was sent to Amsterdam in Europe. That's not a convenient situation in 1662 or 1663. Anyway, the West India Company, when he stood trial, Stuyvesant's employer sent him back with the understanding that Mr. Brown would obey the law. I mean, they did agree with their governor in principle. But again, as I've stated earlier, they also wanted the population growth for the colony. Remember, these were business ventures. These were investments. They wanted to compete with the growing English colonies. They wanted to encourage settlement of skilled labor. Harassing the transplants was bad for business. I mean, in the end, like most situations, follow the money. This was the new focus all over colonial Europe. I mean, one could say it was money over principle. We'll maybe talk about the rise of mercantilism in some future episodes. I know I've taken a ton of notes on it over the years. But that's what drove ambitions. Money. Mercantilism drove and fueled the ambition for money, especially in England. And they are, after all, our primary focus. So however this would have eventually worked itself out doesn't matter anymore. In 1664, the following year, the English took over New Netherland. With the Stuarts now back in power, Charles II gave his brother, the Duke of York, the future James II, all the lands contained within the New Netherland colony. I mean, I'll simplify this. They just kind of showed up and took over. Charles seems to have ignored the Dutch interest altogether. He just gave his brother a bunch of land. It sounds funny to me. That's a story for another day. So the new governor, Richard Nicolls, called a convention, the Hempstead Convention, to figure out what to do on some of these key issues. Now, one of the things I will say is the Dutch all of a sudden became very concerned about religious tolerance, their religious freedom, and the tolerance the English would extend to them. Richard Nicolls was pretty generous. John Underhill was there at the convention. He represented Oyster Bay. He again came away with a powerful appointment. Governor Nicolls named John Underhill High Constable and Surveyor General. The important decision for our consideration today, coming out of the convention, was that there was a law passed forbidding the purchase of land from the Lenape, the Delaware, without the government's consent. And a little later on, John Underhill, in the role of advisor to a band of Delaware, presented a petition to the Council of Assizes, and he received 150 acres of land in Oyster Bay from these same natives. What a great ending to a long career. I mean, I wonder how the Delaware felt about him. After all that past history, he shows up and represents them and actually ends up acquiring 150 acres of land in the process. There's just one more story here that I think is worth talking about quickly. It'll bring us full circle on so many aspects of John Underhill's life. In 1658, his first wife died. I mean, what a life that woman had lived being married to him. But then he married Elizabeth Feake in December of 1658. She had an interesting story of her own to tell, so fitting for the exclamation point to our overview of John Underhill. Elizabeth Feake was the daughter of Elizabeth Phones and Robert Feake. Now, try to keep this straight. Robert was Elizabeth's second husband. So Elizabeth Feake has a mother named Elizabeth Phones. Elizabeth Phones marries a guy named Robert Feake. That's her second husband. And he was considered mentally ill, and he abandoned Elizabeth. Although there was no divorce, Elizabeth Phones, Elizabeth Feake's mother, married William Hallett while Robert was still alive. Talk about scandalous. So right there, you've got some scandal with Elizabeth Feake. But keep up with me here. Elizabeth Feek, the daughter, the second wife of John Underhill, had a sister, Hannah Feek. She was a Quaker and had suffered under Peter Stuyvesant. So John Underhill marries a woman whose sister is a Quaker and had suffered under Peter Stuyvesant. She suffered because her husband was John Brown. Remember, the guy that had been converted to Quakerism in Massachusetts Bay, driven out of Massachusetts Bay, had come over to Long Island, had been preaching Quakerism out of his house, had been arrested by Stuyvesant and sent back to Europe. That John Brown. You recall he had been restored when the West India Company basically told Peter Stuyvesant to ignore the Quakers and pay attention to building their colony and their profits. So John Underhill, the guy who had been on both sides of the religious tolerance debate back in Massachusetts Bay, the guy who had grown up in the Puritan enclaves of the Netherlands, the guy who had firsthand experience of the divisive ways of the Quakers, married into a Quaker family, a dissident Quaker family. I wonder what the day-to-day conversation was between or about or within the separate circles of Peter Stuyvesant and John Underhill at this time. We know they knew each other. We know there had at least been some mutual respect at one time. We know there was tension and even fear on the part of Peter Stuyvesant during the Anglo-Dutch conflicts. But what about these times? Well, even at this older stage in his life, John Underhill went on to have 5 children with Elizabeth Feek, a Quaker. Not just a Quaker from a family that had suffered for their faith. Not just a Quaker, the Quaker who converted the wild man, the administrator, the one with so much blood on his hands from decades of fighting, the man who served 2 nations, John Underhill, to Quakerism. How about that? John Underhill led a remarkable life. Hero, villain, public servant, mass murderer. He was one of the most instrumental figures of his generation. It's hard to figure out. Would you have liked him? Would you have despised him? Would you respect him? Would you challenge him? In the end, John Underhill served in 5 English colonies and the Dutch colony of New Netherland. He battled everybody but the English, who, ironically enough, had chased him out of the most influential, powerful of all of their colonies. When we mention him again, almost in passing in a few weeks, remember all that his name stands for, all that it implies, all that we've unpacked. Through the lens of this short biography of the life of John Underhill, we have examined the last years of the Tudor dynasty, the English community in the Netherlands, the political dynamics of Puritan New England, the absolute dirty work that was done to secure a land for English colonization, the various native interests and tragedies, and the interactions between the Dutch and the English on a pretty intimate level. John Underhill was quite a man. He lived quite a life. I hope that our review these last few weeks has been more than just a biography. I hope it has really helped the history of his day to come alive.
Thanks for listening to History Comes Alive. We hope today's episode has given you valuable new information and inspired you to dive even deeper. Don't forget to check out Jeff's website, historywithjeff.com, and engage with Jeff across all your favorite social media platforms at History with Jeff. Join us next time as more history comes alive.